Picture this. You are asleep. The ground is moving. Not the subtle, easily dismissed tremor that makes you wonder if a large truck just passed outside. The kind of movement that pulls you out of sleep before your brain has fully caught up with what your body already knows. The deep, rolling, wrong kind of shaking that the ground is absolutely not supposed to do. The fire in the center of the shelter is sloshing. The bone framework above you is creaking in a way that sounds like it has opinions about structural integrity that differ significantly from yours. The people around you are already moving, already making noise. The children already crying with the particular pitch that means something has bypassed the usual childhood alarm system and gone straight to the ancient animal fear underneath. You have no earthquake alert on your phone, no emergency broadcast system, no building code that specified seismic resistance when the shelter was constructed. No geological survey telling you whether this is a minor event or the opening act of something catastrophic. You have approximately 4 seconds of rolling ground, a collapsing shelter, and 20 people who need to be somewhere else immediately. What do you do? If you are an ancient human, the answer, learned not from a textbook or a disaster preparedness pamphlet, but from accumulated generational knowledge, from stories told around fires, from the hard-won experience of previous catastrophes that your group survived and encoded into behavior, is that you already know. Not perfectly. Not with the precision of modern emergency management, but well enough, reliably enough, effectively enough that your species navigated volcanic eruptions, megadroughts, tsunamis, floods, earthquakes, and climate shifts that reshaped entire continents without a single piece of infrastructure that modern disaster response takes for granted. And the story of how they did it is considerably more sophisticated, considerably more organized, and considerably more human than most people ever stop to consider. So here is the question that deserves a real answer. How did ancient humans survive natural disasters? Not just the big dramatic events, though those absolutely happened and absolutely threatened human survival, but the entire spectrum of environmental catastrophe that ancient life exposed people to, from the slow-rolling disaster of multi-year drought to the sudden, total violence of a volcanic eruption. Because the answer reveals something fundamental about ancient human intelligence, social organization, and the specific adaptations that allowed a physically unremarkable primate to outlast environmental events that erased far more physically capable species from the fossil record. Start with the baseline reality of what ancient humans were dealing with, because the modern disaster experience, as genuinely terrifying as earthquakes and floods and wildfires are, is cushioned by infrastructure, warning systems, emergency services, and supply chains in ways that make it categorically different from the ancient experience. When an ancient community was struck by a natural disaster, there was no emergency broadcast, no rescue helicopter, no relief convoy bringing food and water from 100 miles away, no insurance claim, no temporary shelter provided by a government agency, no reconstruction fund. There was the group, whatever resources they had managed to retain through the event, and whatever knowledge they collectively possessed about how to navigate what came next. That was the entire disaster response apparatus. And remarkably, not luckily, not accidentally, but through specific adaptive strategies refined over tens of thousands of years, it was often enough. The first and most fundamental of those strategies was mobility. Ancient humans were not rooted to specific locations the way settled agricultural communities are. The ability to move, to identify that a location had become dangerous, and to leave it, carrying the group's essential technology and knowledge to a new place, was one of the most powerful disaster survival tools available. A river flooding its banks catastrophically is an existential crisis for a farming community, with crops in the ground, permanent structures on the floodplain, and years of investment in a specific location. For an ancient mobile group, a flooding river is a signal to move to higher ground, something they were probably watching for and prepared to do because reading landscape and environmental signals was a core survival skill rather than a specialized knowledge set held by professionals. This does not mean ancient humans simply fled from every environmental challenge. The relationship between ancient people and their territory was deeply intimate and extensively mapped across generations. They knew their landscapes in ways that modern people, who mostly experience the natural world through car windows and curated outdoor recreation, find difficult to fully appreciate. Which areas flooded seasonally versus catastrophically? Which slopes were prone to landslide after heavy rain? Which coastline sections were sheltered and which exposed to storm surge? Which valleys channeled dangerous wind? Which geological features indicated underground instability? This knowledge was not written down. It was encoded in stories, in place names, in behavioral norms about where to camp and where to avoid, in the accumulated warnings of elders who had seen things the younger members of the group had not yet witnessed. The oral tradition dimension of ancient disaster survival is one of the most remarkable and most underappreciated aspects of this story. Across multiple cultures and multiple continents, researchers studying indigenous oral traditions have found accounts that appear to describe geological and environmental events with enough specificity to correlate them with datable physical evidence. Oral traditions among Australian Aboriginal communities describe coastline configurations that match the geography of a period when sea levels were dramatically lower. Descriptions of landscapes that were submerged approximately 7,000 years ago but that appear preserved in story form across that entire interval. Traditions in the Pacific Northwest describe events consistent with the behavior of the Cascadia subduction zone in geological terms. Accounts in various cultures describe floods, eruptions, and landscape changes in ways that, when compared to the physical geological record, appear to encode memory of real events across timescales that should, by any intuitive measure, be beyond the reach of oral transmission. What this suggests is that the oral tradition was a disaster information storage and transmission system of extraordinary durability. Not perfectly accurate in every detail across thousands of years of retelling, but accurate enough, specific enough, and persistent enough to encode warnings about rare but catastrophic events across intervals that far exceed individual human memory. The elder telling a story about a great flood that swallowed the coast was not necessarily describing something that happened in their lifetime. They were transmitting information encoded by their predecessors, refreshed and reinforced through repeated retelling, describing a real event that happened to people who were their ancestors and who had survived it, and considered the survival information important enough to encode in story form for the benefit of people they would never meet. This is an astonishing cognitive and cultural achievement. Modern disaster preparedness systems use written records, geological surveys, historical archives, and scientific modeling to build institutional memory of rare catastrophic events. Ancient humans used story, and the story worked well enough to preserve warnings about events that happened thousands of years before the warning was received and acted on. Now examine specific disaster types and how ancient humans responded to them, because the general framework becomes more concrete when applied to particular events. Volcanic eruptions are worth examining first because the archaeological record provides direct evidence of ancient human responses to them, and because the evidence is more complex and more interesting than the simple narrative of people ran away that might seem obvious. The Toba supervolcanic eruption, approximately 74,000 years ago in what is now Sumatra, was among the largest volcanic events of the past several million years. An eruption so massive that it ejected enough material into the atmosphere to cause a volcanic winter lasting years, dramatically reducing global temperatures and collapsing ecosystems across vast areas. The genetic evidence suggests that human populations went through a severe bottleneck around this period. Some researchers have proposed that the human population may have been reduced to a few thousand individuals. Whether Toba was the direct cause of this bottleneck is debated, but the coincidence of timing with a catastrophe of that magnitude is striking and suggests that even our species, with all its adaptive capability, was pushed to the edge of extinction by an event of sufficient scale. What is equally striking is that the species survived. Populations on the African continent, potentially buffered from the worst atmospheric effects by distance and local geography, appear to have pulled through, preserving the genetic lineage that eventually gave rise to all modern humans. The survival of those populations through a multi-year volcanic winter was not a passive accident. It required the full deployment of ancient adaptive strategies. flexibility in diet, mobility to follow shifting resource availability, social cooperation to pool resources and effort, and the knowledge base to identify and exploit food sources that remained viable when primary ones collapsed. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. At smaller scales, volcanic events left archaeological traces that show ancient humans making sophisticated responses to eruption events. Sites near the Campi Flegrei volcanic system in Italy show evidence of repeated ancient occupation, abandonment during eruption events, and reoccupation after conditions stabilized, a pattern repeated across multiple eruption cycles that indicates ancient groups were tracking the behavior of the volcano, understanding the signal of increasing activity, and making timed responses based on that understanding rather than simply fleeing in panic when events became acute. This is environmental monitoring behavior. It is disaster preparedness in a form that requires attention, memory, and the ability to connect current observations to historical patterns, exactly the kind of knowledge that oral tradition was built to transmit. Drought deserves extended attention because it was almost certainly the natural disaster that ancient humans encountered most frequently, and that imposed the most sustained pressure on survival strategies over long time periods. Acute events, eruptions, earthquakes, floods, are dramatic and sudden. Drought is insidious, progressive, and in many respects more dangerous because it depletes resources gradually in ways that can mask the severity of the developing crisis until the group is already in a genuinely difficult position. Ancient responses to drought operated across multiple timescales simultaneously. At the immediate scale, dietary flexibility was the primary tool. Ancient humans were opportunistic omnivores with a remarkably broad dietary repertoire and the knowledge of which food sources remained viable in drought conditions. Deep roots, insects, small animals concentrated around remaining water sources, cached food stores, seeds from drought-tolerant plants, was accumulated knowledge that could be activated when primary food sources failed. The ability to shift from preferred, high-return food sources to less preferred but more drought-resilient alternatives without nutritional collapse was a genuine survival advantage that required both knowledge and social flexibility about food norms. At longer timescales, drought-driven mobility was a strategy that ancient groups appear to have employed systematically. Archaeological distributions of ancient sites across landscapes show patterns consistent with groups expanding their territorial range during dry periods and contracting during wet periods, tracking the shifting availability of resources across landscapes in ways that required both geographic knowledge of distant territories and the social relationships with groups in those territories that would allow passage and access. A group that had maintained reciprocal relationships with neighbors across a wide network could, in a drought crisis, access territories beyond their normal range. A group that had maintained only local relationships had nowhere to go when local resources failed. This is the social insurance dimension of ancient disaster survival, and it may have been one of the most critical adaptive strategies in the entire repertoire. The wide social networks that ancient groups maintained, the gift exchanges, the intermarriage, the shared ceremonies, the maintained relationships across distances that seemed unnecessary in good times, were, in their functional reality, disaster insurance systems. They created obligations of assistance and access that could be called on when catastrophe struck. Ancient communities that invested heavily in maintaining broad social networks were communities that had multiple fallback options when local conditions collapsed. Coastal natural disasters, tsunamis specifically, present a fascinating case study because the evidence for ancient awareness and response to them is both compelling and revealing about the sophistication of ancient environmental knowledge. The geological record of past tsunami events along various coastlines can be correlated with disruptions in archaeological site occupation patterns. Coastal sites abandoned at times consistent with major tsunami events, with reoccupation patterns afterward that sometimes show changed settlement locations suggesting adjustment of coastal use patterns in response. The oral tradition evidence for tsunami awareness is particularly striking in communities with long coastal occupation histories. Descriptions of warning signs, the rapid recession of the sea before a tsunami arrives, the unusual animal behavior that precedes seismic events, the specific appearance of certain wave patterns that indicate danger rather than normal ocean behavior, appear in various forms in the traditional knowledge of communities with ancient coastal occupation histories. These are observational descriptions of real physical phenomena. The sea does recede dramatically before certain tsunami waves arrive. Animals do show unusual behavior before seismic events, responding to infrasound and ground vibration that precedes the human perceptible shaking. The people encoding these observations in traditional knowledge were recording genuine environmental signals that, acted upon, could be the difference between reaching high ground in time and not. Flood response in ancient groups operated on a similarly sophisticated observational basis. Reading river behavior, the signs of upstream rainfall, the color and turbidity changes in river water that indicate distant storm activity in the catchment area, the seasonal patterns of flood risk in specific locations, was knowledge accumulated through generations of occupation near water sources. Ancient camps near rivers were rarely positioned on the immediate floodplain without purpose. Site selection patterns show consistent positioning on elevated ground with river access, rather than on the flood-vulnerable floodplain itself. A pattern that reflects accumulated knowledge about flood risk translated into behavioral norms about where to establish camps. The psychological dimension of ancient disaster survival deserves attention because it is real, significant, and often overlooked in discussions that focus on practical strategies. Natural disasters are terrifying. The total environmental violence of an earthquake, the complete loss of familiar landscape landmarks in a major flood, the darkness and ashfall of a volcanic eruption. These experiences impose psychological stress that can incapacitate individuals and destabilize groups at exactly the moment when functional, coordinated response is most critical. Ancient groups managed this psychological challenge through several mechanisms that were simultaneously practical and cultural. The presence of experienced elders who had witnessed previous disasters and survived them provided a form of psychological stabilization that is difficult to overstate. An elder who had lived through a comparable event, who could communicate through their own calm and their own continued existence that the experience was survivable, provided the group with something that modern disaster psychology calls a model of resilience. A living demonstration that the current terror has an endpoint, and that people who navigate it correctly come through the other side. Ritual and ceremony also served genuine psychological functions in disaster response and recovery. The ceremonies that ancient groups performed in the aftermath of catastrophic events, the mourning rituals for those lost, the ceremonies marking return to or abandonment of a place, the stories that integrated the disaster event into the group's larger narrative about itself and its history, were not simply cultural performances. They were mechanisms for processing collective trauma, reestablishing group identity after a destabilizing event, and encoding the experience in forms that would be transmissible to future generations. The disaster became part of the story the group told about itself, and in becoming part of the story, it became information that future members of the group could draw on. Children born after the disaster grew up in a community that had survived it, surrounded by people who carried the experience, learning from them not just the practical knowledge of what had happened and how the group had responded, but the identity of being people who had faced that kind of thing and continued. This transmission of disaster experience as community identity was a form of psychological preparation for future events that operated across generations without requiring the traumatic direct experience to be repeated. Resource diversification was another ancient strategy that functioned as disaster preparation without necessarily being framed that way. Groups that maintained diverse subsistence strategies, combining hunting, gathering, fishing, and the exploitation of multiple different ecosystem types, were groups that had redundancy built into their resource base. No single disaster event was likely to collapse all of those sources simultaneously. A drought that reduced terrestrial plant food availability might concentrate fish in remaining water sources. A flood that disrupted terrestrial hunting might create abundant fish and waterfowl opportunities. The diversity that looked like opportunism or ecological flexibility in normal times functioned as resilience in disaster conditions. Toolkit diversity worked on similar principles. Groups that maintained a broad range of tools, adapted to different resource types, different environmental conditions, different seasonal opportunities, were groups that could pivot their subsistence strategy rapidly when primary strategies were disrupted by environmental events. A group with a narrow, highly specialized toolkit was a group whose disaster response options were constrained by the limits of what their tools could do. A group with broad technical repertoire could improvise, adapt, and find functional approaches to novel challenges that their specific toolkit had not been designed for but could be applied to. The cumulative picture that emerges from examining ancient disaster survival across all of these dimensions is not one of passive, frightened creatures at the mercy of an indifferent natural world. It is a picture of organisms with deep environmental knowledge, sophisticated social organization, cultural information storage systems of remarkable durability, psychological resilience mechanisms embedded in community structure and ritual practice, and adaptive flexibility across diet, territory, technology, and social alliance that allowed them to absorb shocks that would have been fatal to less adaptable species. Ancient humans were not disaster-proof. Events of sufficient magnitude, the Toba eruption being the most dramatic example, pushed human populations to the edge of extinction and in some regions probably past it. Individual ancient humans died in floods, in eruptions, in earthquakes, in droughts, in the cascading consequences of all of these. The survival was never guaranteed and never costless. But the species survived, repeatedly, across the full range of environmental catastrophe that a geologically active, climatically variable planet can produce. They survived because the adaptive package that ancient humans possessed, cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, cultural information transmission, dietary and territorial and technological versatility, was, in aggregate, among the most powerful disaster response systems that natural selection has ever produced in any organism. Every ancient human who looked at the ground moving under them and knew which direction was uphill, every elder who told the story of the last great flood so clearly that it shaped where their grandchildren chose to camp, every group that maintained relationships with distant neighbors for years of normal times so that those neighbors would share resources in the crisis year, all of them were contributing to a survival system that was distributed across people and time rather than concentrated in infrastructure and institutions. The infrastructure came later. The intelligence behind it was ancient.